Hi everyone, welcome to the latest video interview series organized by the Institutum. I'm here today with contemporary artist and cultural medallion winner Amanda Heng. Those of us who have gone to see exhibitions or art projects over the last decade surely will be familiar with Amanda's work, and you may even have been involved as a contemporary artist. Amanda Heng works across multiple mediums: installation, photography, and of course, performance. And here is Amanda, and we're with Amanda in her studios here in Teluk Kurau. Hello, Amanda.
Hi, Boon Hui.
Hi. I know you've been so active all through your career. What are you doing now, actually?
At the moment, preparing for this shows is coming up for the Art Weeks with great project on conversation. Conversation was another kind of project that involved or employ very everyday gesture or activities. And I, as usual, create platforms to engage with participants in a hope that we could experience some deeper conversations during the time as a live performance.
I think that's wonderful, and I'm often, and we spoke earlier, I'm often struck by how, even though you work in what we now call conceptual forms of art, one thread that runs through is really about connecting people and opening up lines of conversation and communication, regardless of the form. Let's go back to maybe your beginning. And I know I've read some early interviews where you spoke about how you became an artist, and actually you became an artist quite late in life. You went to Lasalle only in your 30s, and in that period, the late 80s, 90s, it was I think a quite radical decision to make to become a full-time artist. And you were in tax, I believe you were saying. So could you say a little bit about what made you take that quite brave step at that?
I would say it, as I say, naive in those days. Yeah. But what I remember that I knew was that it was not my life in the office. Yeah. And I have to find another way of, making meaning in my life. I started to kind of figure out eventually the cultural aspect or art, would be my interest.
What about art at that time, in the way that you were thinking about your life, you felt that would answer the question that you had?
I didn't have any idea at all because in those days, I don't think there was any kind of role models for you to follow where art was seen as a profession. Yeah, that was like 80s. So it was difficult, but all I knew was that I cannot go back to office life, but I must figure out in terms of how to deal with some of the questions in my life that I was asking. So I make a trip, a backpack trip to Europe. The trip makes a big difference for me because it opens up about other possibilities. And I remember visiting museums and looking at a lot of different things and realized that there were other aspects that was not happening in Singapore, and that why don't we try figure out in Singapore. And at a point in time, I found out that Lasalle was having some kind of classes. I think they were pretty new then,
Yes.
as compared to
Yes.
NAFA. I took a kind of decisions to do part-time because I had to kind of give tuition to carry on with my life. Then after giving up
practical
salary
realities.
jobs,
Yes.
I was perhaps fortunate to meet with a group of artists who came back from overseas, like Jock Tin and then Dao and Chai Hyang, and have chance to learn under them. So they are forms of expressions that I think will probably open up the very different thinking about art making, which tends to be only about painting and sculpture. Yeah, it's a more traditional form.
Most of your career, even before you really became known publicly for your performances, was in newer forms, was in installation, for instance, rather than oil on canvas, easel painting. So I remember reading about some of your early installations, but even then, in works like Missing and so on, you were already very concerned with what you mentioned before: domestic rituals, domestic daily life, and the lives of women, which are particularly the aspects that are sort of silenced or we didn't know. I mean, how did you come upon that?
I think the questions that I mentioned that I have at that point of time to answer about my life, I come at this stage, like in my 30s, and was confronted with questions about, how to carry on with my life. For other people would be naturally get married and have families and children and so on. But I wasn't really thinking about all those things because there were so many other questions that I wanted to ask. Why life had to be so programmed? Art become the space or the language for me to make those inquiries. The questions also parallel with developments of Singapore national identity.
Yes.
Yeah, so we were experiencing very drastic changes in 70s, 80s, and 90s. All these pushed me to look at all these very critical questions about how do you make sense of your life in the midst of all these very drastic changes, in the midst of looking to understand what does it mean to be a citizen in an independent country, newly independent country. Those became very important issues for me to deal with. Identity politics, gender relations, and things like that. Very naturally started with myself. So I was basically looking for answer for myself. And at that point of time, I have to say is that I wasn't really much into understanding gender politics and so on. Yeah, but it was gradually after that that I was exposed to more theoretical discussions. And I started to kind of look around me in my own environment and address those very grounded issues as a start.
Now that you've got a long history as a practicing artist and you've had retrospectives and books published, when I go through them, what struck me was really that you were less about like agitating over the ideals, but really the implications for the individual of what life was and the things that people lived in. It mattered to people at an individual level. Like what being a housewife meant, what being a woman who made a life, a career, being at home, looking after the family, and all these things meant. And I think that really distinguished your work now that we see it in the context of those nation building years. We always talk about these big stories and grand structure, but I think where you filled in really was to take that and say, but what does it mean for a woman? What does it mean for an individual?
The more grounded way of addressing those huge issues has to come from individuals. What does that mean to the people when we talk about a newly independent country? Individuals' life makes the country. Apart from finding the inquiries about finding answer for my life, I was at the same time also asking questions about what does it mean, what makes a country independent, what are the contents in that independence, what are we heading. Finding this direction has to start from the basic fundamental questions of who are these individual citizens, what are they doing, what kind of life do they have. Yeah. So for me, those are very solid ground to look into. Interesting sources for thinking, for asking critical questions, for actually looking into the process of building a nation.
You have, really given to the scene, a repertoire of very iconic performances that are also distinguished by their participatory nature, and they are not performances for people to watch only. So how did you come upon performance, and how did you develop some of your iconic performances?
I actually do begin with using the body, the artist as the artwork. But I was also very interested in communication, the relation between people and their environments and so on, how the body relates to audience as well as the space. So how do you make sense of those things for during that period when you're presenting your experience with the audience. But I think eventually when I had those issues dealt with and then moved on further, I realized that whole practice or my own concern were actually very people-oriented.
Yes.
So from my relations, working with my mom, from that perspective, looking at gender politics, the role of women, or how do they see themselves as individual women, and those kind of questions, and then come down to our generation. In the process of modernization, what is a modern woman, and those kind of questions and all that. Answering this very personal question is also everybody's question.
Yes.
Yeah, not only just the women themselves, but it's the whole country, the people who makes up the country. What contribution can an individual make to the building of the nation? Yeah, I think that was the bigger issues that I realized we have to kind of look into. And of course, I found out that there were so little platforms for articulation. Yeah, so how can I create certain space in my work to allow participations among the audience so that certain conversations, as I mentioned earlier, can happen. The practice moved on to the more audience-oriented, audience-based engagement. And now focus is on the audience themselves. So audience often were then pushed to be active. So the work actually is being completed by the audience most of the time. So it runs a risk of how artists actually forego that control. What is interesting about live practice is that what they offer is not an object, not a conclusion, but more a process, an experience. Then these experiences etch into your memory. So it's very different from object making, where you rely on publishing books or having talks and things like that. So I think what I'm interested is that how this individual eventually carries with them this experience, and how it might affect in some way, impacted their lives.
It's still connected to earlier ideas about the body, right? Because these kind of repetitive actions or actions or encounters that the individual who participate in your performance projects, in the end, they internalize it into their body. That is that moment of potential change, right? Or a kind of, I suppose, revelation, for want of a better word. Years ago at Singapore Art Museum, when we were talking about the Let's Chat thing, and I remember you said, no, the taugeh is not the point. The point is that people talk to each other. This is only the platform and to encourage people to talk to each other, and suddenly there's a possibility somebody who is a stranger to you at the end of it is no longer just a stranger. They may not be a friend yet, but they are not just a stranger. And I think for an urban industrialized society that tends to atomize groups of people, I think that's a very precious thing, this potential for developing new forms of social ties.
That reminded me of this image that I see often now in the train or on the bus. The whole family is going for a family outing, but each and every one of the family members are having their screen on their hands and concentrating on that, And this is family outing. My memories of growing up was like families get together, do some chores and prepare for lunch, like packing taugeh and all that. But at the same time, you quarrel, you create dirty jokes, and information got exchanged, and you get to know what's happening to other people. Hopefully, through the work, bring up those issues and allow people to think about it and questions cause and values of progress. Everything is in the name of progress, but is that right? Is that so? So that was the idea, I guess.
And to have it grounded in something that is very relatable to the individual, even if you aren't really familiar with the language of art, you don't need to be. And I think the other thing that's very interesting to me in the context of Singapore, it also suggests that one should also perhaps question, these simple terms that we have right now of what is community art, what is, art education. It's not about looking at artworks that artists produce. It's a way also to, in a sense, build some sort of community.
I think terms are created for in the West, in their history. There's a historical context. And when we pluck that from there and then put it in our local context, we have to start from readdressing it, redefining it, perhaps, for our own purpose. Yeah, so I think what I'm doing is the process of that.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think that really this word grounded means a lot. It's quite central to your practice. Since the beginning.
Art is always about life, and I also believe that everyone has their own creativity. Like having worked with my mom, I found out a lot about her, how she has found ways to understand her cooking, her material, and then her way of approach to houseworks and things like that. I think those are creativity. So I learned from that and put that into my practice. So by engaging with the general public, you then learn from them about various ways they actually could make their work creative in their life.
So you're also really expressing this position that art is part of life. It's not something that stands apart and you are sort of generating separately.
Yes, just like what Joseph Beuys have said, everyone can be artist.
Yes.
Yeah, if only you pay attention to what you have.
So speak about your more recent work when you've also continued many of your concerns, but it's gone online, your single project, which has gotten a little bit of a kerfuffle. And of course, it's a project that is durational. It's occurring over quite a long period of time.
Singles is a persona. I'm still dealing with the bodies, but these singles represented a specific female representations when we became independent and set up our own airline to represent Singapore. And then the Singapore girl, which is the air hostess, were created as an image for advertising, and they become very iconic image. So that troubles me because then it's kind of a stereotype image that is being reinforced again and again. But this image suggests a very Asian, exotic female feature, always having that smile, ever ready to serve. But we're actually very diligent, intelligent, independent, hardworking. But this was totally ignored in that image. Worse still, it is created by a foreign image maker. The trouble is that when you declare yourself a newly independent country and you're making these representations created from a foreign colonizers to represent our independence. So that was really ironical. And these singles address what's happening here and what we are proud of as Singaporean women, and that what are our concerns. So that's what Single is about. But it comes through in many ways: a print, some objects, and then installation work, performances. And I think what was really interesting for me was that because I've gone through all these different forms of art making, and I finally found this persona who could engage us with all these different art forms and then speaks about very concerned issues. It has got to be an open-end performance, ongoing until I die, I guess. We're dying an old a senior single.
It would be very radical in terms of Singapore girl.
The recent case was Single tried to engage with the audience who was so familiar with virtual space. The whole thing was about how, in my memory, the Singapore girl were a contingent in our National Day parade. So my original idea was to form a contingent. Obviously, this was not going to happen. And then I begin to think about, then if it is not happening, then why can't I make it into an animation and then let it happen on virtual space? Sam picked up these ideas, and then we have the chance to present it, in an installation that engages participants to contribute their bare bottom, the image of their bare bottom as part of the animations in parade. So what you see was on TV, all these bare-bottom parading as a contingent.
Why did you choose to invite the public to take an image of themselves?
Because I feel that this is issues that everybody should be involved. By engaging them in the process, hopefully it raised or it provoked in them the questions that I had. The engagement with the society, engagement with policy making, the process of modernization and nation building in this country is a very important part for everyone to be involved, not just decision made by a small group of people. Yeah, I think it's time, being a citizens in this country, take that responsibilities and get engaged in this meaningful process. Yeah,
it's very patriotic in its own way, So, we shouldn't think that artists are just like heroes. Art, I think an art practice is much more sophisticated than that. So, do you think is this project, of course, it's very open-ended, is it something that you will continue to work on and develop, or you feel it's done?
It will go on. Most of the work continue. For example, the Let's Check, the work with my mother and other women continue to become narrating body between women. Let's Check actually come from there also. Yeah. And then Let's Check now turn into We Are the World. These are our stories, which happened in STPI in 2017. Yeah. And then the Walk series ended up to be the most recent work, which is Every Step Counts. So the whole practice of the work themselves always develops and with time. And then, of course, also addressing my own bodily growth. Yeah. So the reality of this body that's getting, aging.
As you're talking, in essence, how the development of your work and the fact that one project morphs into another, it really does demonstrate very powerfully and clearly your focus on the process, So it's almost as if all these projects are never finished, because it's not about ending with a nice artwork that you could put in a ribbon or a frame and then could be offered. It really is the fact that it's never finished and continues to grow is the artwork.
Art is an open space, and every individual get involved in that have to find their own solution, have to define for themselves what art means to them. Through engaging with your audience, I want them to have this realization, and so that they could take control of their own meaning in life. How you engage with your audience and what level of engagement, nature of engagement, forms of engagement are the interesting point. And of course also issues engaged. It is a slow process. I'm not looking for a kind of spectacular engagement. Yeah. This slow process has its own meaning, as the Chinese would say, 细水长流. Yeah, I think I look for those more enduring experiences.
And of course, it's completely grooving in with your concern for the rhythms of individual life and the experiences of individual people, and how individuals are transformed rather than this horrible thing called national change.
I have to say that the country has put in a lot of effort, because it's compared from where I started 30 years ago. Today, everything become institutionalized. But you do have more mature systems to provide necessary funding, space, and creating audience base and things like that. Like even today, the project that we're talking about art, these are all part of the education process. Thinking about our independence for about slightly more than 50 years, as compared to countries like China or America, this is very short. What we need now is perhaps to look into more kind of nuances and put in more deeper kind of engagement. Yeah, so that the effort we put in would be more fruitful. Yeah, so this is what
and
I hope
the
to see.
imprint
Yes.
is deeper.
Yes,
rather than just, I suppose, bums on seats. We're grateful to have artists such as yourself who is so committed over such a long period of time, working on things that are trying to always deepen the level of engagement. I think that's really valuable. So thank you, Amanda. It's really
Thank you.
nice to speak to you and hear about work. Hopefully, when this video premieres during the Art Week, we'll also see some of them come to your new project during the Soar with at Grey projects.
Thank you.
So thank you.